And I'm going to read, therefore, from 1 Kings 17, verses 7 to 16. So I'm going to start where I left off last week. Elijah is in the desert by the, what's it called? Kerith Ravine. I've forgotten what it was called for a minute. So he's sitting by the Kerith Ravine, having been sent there by the Lord because he had told the wicked king Ahab that there would be no rain. And so for his protection, God sent him into the desert. And here he is by the brook. And he is being fed faithfully day by day by the ravens. And he's drinking from the brook. And verse 7 begins, sometime later, the brook dried up, because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you've said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. Probably a story that you know well. When we looked at Elijah last week in the Kerith Ravine, we looked at how his character was shaped by that experience. The development of who he was to be the man of God. We looked at how he went in as a God-fearing man, and now he is becoming a man of God. And then when things got desperate, when the brook dried up, so his water supply either diminished and run out or just stopped, we don't know, it doesn't indicate. The word of the Lord moved him on. That must have been a mighty relief to Elijah, to move on. But he was patient. He waited for the word of the Lord. He could have perhaps seen the signs that the brook was drying up and thought, I better get out of here. I better move on, because otherwise I'm going to die here. What are you doing, God? You sent me here. But he didn't. He waited for the word of the Lord. And he moved from his place of refuge and sanctuary to Zarephath. Okay, that's fine. That sounds all right, doesn't it? You know. Except if you knew that Zarephath was a place where metal was smelted. The refining and smelting of metals. Basically, Zarephath was a place of furnaces, the place of fiery trials. You might quite rightly think that Elijah had a point saying, you've sent me from a challenging place to a place of fiery trials. Is that right? I wonder if that's been your life experience, that you've gone from one hard thing to actually a harder thing, even though you felt God had lifted you out of the hard thing. And then you discover that where you've been put or placed or sent actually is even harder. If Kerith was to be a shaping and perhaps pruning experience, Zarephath is going to be a testing place, a crucible even. And not only was the destination difficult, actually the journey would have been difficult, because Zarephath was, if you can kind of make sense of the maps then and the maps now and the wisdom of people who know about these things, it was probably about 100 miles distance from where he had been. So he'd got to cross the land where Ahab's wife Jezebel was hunting the prophets of the Lord. So to make the journey from where he was to where he'd got to go was in effect putting his head above the parapet. And he would be in danger. And the land was in drought. But he'd got to cross the land to get to Zarephath. And I'm not going to focus so much on the first bit, as mysterious as it is. He turns up at the city gate. There's a widow there collecting sticks, and somehow Elijah speaks to her, and she is the one. We don't understand, because it doesn't tell us how that conversation even developed. Has God said, the women at the gate, he could have said to any number of women, are you the one that God sent to provide for me? And they probably would have just looked at him and gone, I don't even know what you're talking about. Maybe she was the only one there. We don't know. But we do know that she was literally in despair. She was at her wit's end because she was collecting enough sticks, not even wood, but sticks, to make a bit of a fire so that she could use the last of her provisions to make bread. And then, realistically, she understood there would be no more. But Elijah challenges her. So, the place of fiery trials, this is the first trial, I think, and there are others to come. This is the first trial. The widow is to be the source of his provision. A widow. Not exactly the highest of society in these days. And not only that, a poor and destitute widow. A widow who is desperate. What a humbling experience for a man who's been fed directly by the hand of God via the ravens, who's now got to rely on somebody who is in complete poverty. It's hard enough, isn't it, being on the receiving end of generous hospitality. It's much more humbling to be the recipient of hospitality that comes out of poverty. And that's what Elijah has to do. He has to learn the humility of being a dependent of this woman. Yes, via God, but he's got to rely on her in order to be the hand of God, if you like. But he doesn't give up easily. And even when the widow says, but I haven't got enough, he encourages her to go home, make the bread, but bring something small for him first. It's almost as though he hasn't heard, but it's all that we've got, and then we're going to die, and you're asking me to give it to you? It's almost like he hasn't heard her. But then Elijah says, if you do this, you will see the provision of God. Credit to her, she does it. And he says, the supply of flour will not be exhausted, and the oil will not run out. Now, I don't know what you think when you hear those words. Do you imagine that every day that they go back, the jar's topped up to the top? Is that what you think? It's not what it means. What it means is it won't run out. So my suspicion is that they have to use what's in the jar, all of it, and trust it's going to be there again tomorrow. I think that's what it means. Which is very different from going, whoa, we've got a full jar. We don't have to worry until it gets down to the bottom, and then we'll go back to God. No, this is a Enough provision, not a plentiful provision. And that's so much harder to live with, isn't it? Enough. Because enough takes care of today. It doesn't assure us of tomorrow. It's a daily exercise of faith for her as well as for him. And when we hear that the promise of God that he is our provider, I don't know why, but we tend to think that's always going to be plentiful. And sometimes it is, but more often it's enough. It's enough. So I wonder what's happening for you in life right now. Are you in the place of the widow, who is at, if you like, wit's end, desperate, because you can't quite see how it's going to go on. You can't quite see how things are going to be managed. Or maybe you've got your jar and you don't want to use what's in the jar because you can't quite be sure whether it's going to be there tomorrow. And yet the promise of God for her was that it would be. But she had to use it. She couldn't save it. It's a bit like, when the guys in the desert had to go out and collect the manna. Only on one day of the week could they get double the provision. And it was enough for the day. So Elijah has to rely on somebody in poverty. Is poverty an experience for you right now? And we don't have to be talking about money. It could be poverty in our spiritual lives, poverty in our relationships. It might be poverty of money, poverty of family, poverty in our health. Perhaps losing sight of independence. These are big issues. But God promises enough for the day. Enough for the day. That was his promise to Elijah and the woman. And I have to say, since the beginning of COVID, that's been the word of the Lord for us here, to rely on the daily flour and oil financially. And there has been enough for the day. We have to rely on the faithfulness of God. Not always in abundance, but sometimes enough.